So this is Ross Winton. Ross received his Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Management and an MS in Entomology from Montana State University. He is currently the state invertebrate biologist for Texas Parks and Wildlife and is responsible for coordinating and promoting the conservation and management of all native invertebrate species of conservation need in the state of Texas. He has experience working with a variety of wildlife species, from tiny beetles to upland birds and elk in North America, as well as field work abroad. And I'm super excited because we saw our first dung beetles here just in the spring over here at Lake Georgetown. So I want to know more about them.
Awesome. Can you guys hear me okay?
You're good.
Wonderful. Just want to make sure the audio is coming through. Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Michelle and Randy. So I'm just going to give you guys a quick, like 45 minutes or so, kind of discussion of Texas dung beetles, a little bit about their distribution, the diversity within Texas, a little bit about their life history, and also kind of some different opportunities. You know, if folks are interested in dung beetles, ways you can kind of document maybe what you have in your own backyard, or, you know, if you're going out to places like Berry Springs, like they had in the starting slideshows, you know, just different ways that you can be keeping an eye out for dung beetles, because they are kind of a species that falls under the radar, a group of species that fall under the radar, but they play a very important role in our ecosystems throughout Texas and the world. So my talk is always, I try to keep things light. So the title of this talk is Why I Play with Poo and So Should You. And I will tell you that, you know, we are going to be talking about dung and scat and other things like that. So, you know, if you're squeamish or you don't like to hear talking about those kinds of things, then this is not the talk for you, because that's what all of these species I'll be talking about utilize as a major part of their life cycle. So just as I always start my presentations, I like to give folks a snapshot. I know you guys as master naturalists are intimately familiar with Texas Parks and Wildlife and what we do. In the non-game and rare species program, we're responsible for all the non-game animals, plants, and natural communities in the state of Texas. So we have a pretty broad role, and what we do is kind of that natural resource portion of our overall department mission to manage the natural and cultural resources. So we're kind of that small subset, and I know you guys interact with a lot of our staff pretty regularly and know a lot of what we do on the ground throughout Texas. So as I said, just a disclaimer, this is going to be a poop talk. So, I mean, maybe you guys have had talks about scat and other things like that, but we'll be talking about, you know, different aspects of dung physiology, if you will, or morphology, but not all scarabs. So most of the dung beetles that I'll be talking about in this talk they're beetles, as the name implies, but they're scarabs, or they're in the Scarabidae family. So most of the ones I'll be talking about are in that family, but not all scarabs utilize dung. So there's a lot of other species that utilize, you know, they feed on fruits, they feed on fungus, they really fill a wide variety of niches throughout the ecosystems, not just in Texas, but globally. In Texas, we have about 600 species of scarab that are in the family Scarabidae. And most of them are dung specialists. They also fill other niches as well. They're not specialists per se, but they're generalists and they'll utilize dung. Most of them have very enhanced sensory systems, so they're able to detect dung or detect odors or pheromones that are out in the landscape so that they can find these things. Sometimes if you're talking about, you know, something as small as a rabbit dropping, they have the ability, some of these species have the ability to detect really small volumes of dung. So, and they use the antennae, the main feature of their sensory system, to kind of triangulate where they are. So if you think about like the rabbit ears on your old televisions, those of you who are old enough to have had rabbit ears, and you're kind of trying to direct the antennae where, you know, the tower is. So what they're doing is they're honing in, triangulating, well, it's the concentration of what I'm smelling higher on the right side or the left side. So if it's higher on the right, they'll get a stronger signal on the right antennae first. So they'll kind of travel and follow that, whatever smell they happen to be picking up on, whether it's dung or females or other things like that. But the main feature, the reason why many of these utilize dung is they use it for food, and it's primarily for their larvae. So they're growing and developing immature beetles. So what they do is they will utilize it, and I'll get through kind of some of the different strategies that they have to utilize dung on the landscape. But that's the primary reason why they're trying to find dung on the landscape. And like I said, they fill a variety of niches, and they use dung in different ways, and they're really very charismatic. I mean, you see that species on the left, that's a species we have in Texas. It's one of the Phaneus or rainbow scarabs. Very, very pretty. You see them a lot in kind of the late spring, sometimes into the early summer is when I see them most active, and they have that really pronounced horn on the males, really bright purples and pinks and greens and blues, just a really charismatic species. And they're actually fairly good size. I mean, they're some of them can get up to about an inch plus. So I mean, when we're talking about invertebrates, as many of you guys know, we're talking on the scale of centimeters, inches sometimes if you're lucky. So a lot of these things are very small, and often they can be overlooked pretty easily. So just to give you guys a little bit of morphology or a little bit of understanding of the kind of anatomy of a dung beetle. So the great ways to distinguish the scarabs from a lot of other beetles is their front legs. So if you look in that front, those two front legs that are sticking out, they have kind of wide paddle-like outer edges that often are toothed, but they have really wide front tibia. And you kind of can think of it similar to a human tibia. So that section of their front legs is much broader. I always think of them or describe them as kind of like a paddle, and they kind of use that to move through the dung. Their antennae are usually 9 or 10 segmented. And the really interesting thing, if you look at that picture on the left of this slide, they have this what are called lamellate antennae. So the last 3 to 7 sections of their antennae will actually be they'll be flattened, and they can actually be expanded and folded, kind of like your fingers coming apart. And this is a really good picture of a male. They have really pronounced lamellate antennae that they use, and these are basically their radar detection units. So they're using these to pick up and hone in on all those pheromones or those scents that they're tracking. And then with a lot of beetles, we use something called a tarsal formula. So the tarsi are those small segments at the ends of each of their leg segments. So you can kind of think of them like those last few, kind of like your the segments of your fingers, if you will, except it's just kind of several small segments at the ends of their appendages. And most of the beetles in the scarabs, they have what's called a 5-5-5. And what that means is the front appendages have 5 on this is on each side, and then the middle has 5, and then the hind leg also has 5. And in other beetles, you can have a variety of those tarsal formulas. But in some cases, some of these scarabs are really unique, and they actually, that front tarsi will be a 0, but typically where they don't have those tarsi or those end segments, but it's usually 5-5-5. So that's a great way to, if you're looking at them and you pull one of these scarabs up, you can count those little tarsi and then kind of add those things up. Usually with the aid of a microscope, but a lot of times some of these larger beetles, you can identify them pretty easily. And then another thing I wanted to point out, it's not very well displayed in this image particularly, but you can see that horn kind of up on the head. So in a lot of these scarabs, they have a wide variety of different structures, either on their head or on their pronotum. So that pronotum is that directly behind the head, that segment just behind the head. And so when I get through some of these different groups to kind of give you guys examples of some of the scarabs you might see around in Texas, those are some other really interesting features. So like the Phaneus, those rainbow scarabs that I showed you on the last slide, that has a really pronounced horn on it, especially in the males. And you see those really pronounced horns usually in the males, but in some of these species, they'll have really, really small, maybe a bump or what's called a tubercle or some kind of little projection that happens to be there on some of the females, but usually it's reduced. So why use poop? I get that question a lot. So why did dung beetles decide, one day the dung beetles said, I think I'm going to use poop to feed my young? So it's a good question. And the big thing is it's available. I mean, if anyone's heard the book or you read the book to your kids, Everybody Poops, or your grandkids, it's out there. All the mammals, all the birds, I mean, many of the wildlife species on planet Earth defecate in some way, and it's got to be used. And as a result, especially when you have large concentrations of animals, it's very abundant. And there's a regular supply. So there isn't a seasonal aspect to pooping. I mean, that's not something typically with most animals. There are some that, especially in the deserts where, they tend to defecate less when seasons are dry and more during the wetter seasons, just based on, their digestive system's ability to pull more moisture out, the less they do that. And there's relatively low search effort for a lot of these things as well. I mean, it's not hard if you've smelled a dirty diaper, there's a dirty diaper in there in that room, or even across the house sometimes. So it's not very difficult to find dung in many cases. And it's really a matter of, is this waste or is it food? Because a lot of animals, and you can see it really well in this picture, this dung has been really heavily utilized by these dung beetles, but there's a lot of organic material that's still left undigested. A lot of animals, in particular, a lot of ungulates, are very inefficient in digesting all of the nutritional value out of the food that they eat. And as a result, they pass a lot of that through their digestive system. So these insects and the dung beetles and other things that utilize dung are able to take advantage of those extra nutritional resources that are out there. And like I said, they use this primarily for reproduction. So they feed it to their young to help them develop. And so I mentioned that, there's kind of a little bit of anatomy or morphology of a pile of dung. And so we're going to discuss a few of the ways that these dung beetles will utilize this. So as we have lots and lots, if you've ever seen these dung beetles in action, where you have a large active pile of dung, it can be very active. I mean, the whole thing is moving and undulating. And I had wanted to put a video in there, but I know sometimes the videos have issues when we're doing it virtually. But I wanted to discuss a little bit about how these different dung beetles have adapted and utilized dung in different ways. Because if you have dung, as soon as it lands on the ground, these things are going to show up within minutes. And the competition can be pretty high, especially when the densities of dung beetles are really high. A lot of our prairies and grasslands, there's a large communities of dung beetles that are all trying to take advantage of these resources that are out there. So they've adapted different ways to try and partition or pull away that dung so that there's less competition and no one's likely to take it. The first group are the dwellers, or the endocoprids. These ones are the ones that burrow within or just underneath the dung. So they get into the actual, like if you think of a cow pie is usually the best way to visualize this. They get into the thick of it. I mean, they're in the dung, moving around inside of it, trying to get at pieces of dung that they can then utilize. And they'll actually be living within the dung, and they're, in many cases, some of their larvae will be maturing within the actual dung pile. The tunnelers, which are the paracoprids, they're the ones that tunnel below the dung. And if you see in that image, what they actually do is, if you've ever flipped an older cow pie over, you'll see little holes in the ground underneath the cow pies. In some cases, sometimes those are flies, but in many instances, those are actually those dung beetles that what they do is they go underneath the dung pile and they take a small portion of dung down into a tunnel that they've excavated, where they deposit the dung underground, lay their egg, and then leave it. And then sometimes they'll do, multiple balls of dung in one chamber. Other times they'll partition those out into individual chambers. All the species have kind of different strategies for how they do this. And then lastly are the rollers, and these are the ones that a lot of people are familiar with when it comes to dung beetles. And what they're going to do, their strategy to try and take those resources and make sure that they're the ones that get to utilize it, is by rolling it away. So that's the reason why you see dung beetles moving dung from a pile and rolling it around across the landscape, is to take it somewhere else, away to that area where there's lots of competition for the resource. And then what they do is they dig a burrow, and then they bury that dung, lay the egg, and they take it to a place away from the regular dung pile. So they're really distributing that dung around on the landscape. So kind of they play a really important role because it starts kind of the decomposition process and also the distribution. So in the case of, say, those rollers, what they're doing is they're moving that dung away from the dung pile. And anyone who has had, we utilize, dung and manure and things like that for fertilizer. So it has lots of extra nutrients that are available or can be decomposed further to be made available to plants. And those really, in a lot of dung, those nutrients are kind of trapped. I mean, they can be broken down by bacteria, they can be broken down by other processes, but I mean, really, this is a quick and easy way to get those nutrients that are trapped distributed out, and then when the larvae consume them and they defecate, then they're processing that dung further to make those nutrients more available to plants that are in the ecosystem that they happen to inhabit. And what they'll do is, so you have the vertical distribution of nutrients with those species that are pulling the dung under the soil, but then you also have that horizontal distribution when they're taking the dung away from the actual dung pile. So you get this kind of nice distribution of those nutrients onto the landscape. And often this is it's a part of this interconnected and interdependent system. So you have, when you think of like your classic grazing with the bison or with a lot of these free roaming animals on historic prairies and grasslands, is you have this relationship where these bison are moving through, they're dropping the dung, which is then refeeding and renewing the resources that were taken. So those prairies can then use those nutrients to grow and recuperate from these sometimes intensive grazing situations. And then those dung beetles help to make those nutrients available faster. So they're a part of this interconnected system in the case of many, many different ecosystems. And grasslands are really that really perfect example of how this cycle works really well. And it's global. I mean, it's not just, Texas and North American grasslands and prairies or savannas. It's globally, this is those relationships that you find in many of those ecosystems. And in some cases, the dung beetles are actually culturally significant. When you get to places like Egypt and the Far East, you'll actually see dung beetles represented, and most folks think of it, you see the Egyptian symbols of the dung beetle, and it's a symbol of rebirth. So there's a lot of cultural significance to some of these dung beetles as well around the globe. And that's because, there's new birth coming out of something that, you normally think is waste, but they played a very important role. And if you've seen, the mummy movies where, there's these, what look to be scarabs, crawling under people's skin, killing them and all kinds of that does not happen. I always tell people, they're like, oh, well, they can be dangerous. No, they don't do that to people. So don't worry about that. That's kind of one of those weird things that the media has kind of taken and ran with, but it's not true in reality. So with those grasslands and prairies, if you remove any of those core pieces, whether it's the dung beetles or the grasses and the large herbivores, it really starts to collapse, or its capacity is diminished a great deal. So that's why it's really important, and we're really interested in these dung beetles, is because, especially as we look at grassland conservation, because in North America, grasslands have been reduced to just a fraction of where they were historically. So they're one of our fastest disappearing ecosystems on the planet, and especially in North America. So it's something we're really concerned about, but you can't restore grasslands if you don't restore the whole system. So one of the things that we're seeing with the population declines with a lot of our native dung beetles is just, we've seen a loss of native grazers. So, we've lost bison, we've lost the free ranging systems that once existed on many of these grasslands and prairies, and in a variety of other ecosystems as well. So dung beetles, they don't just, don't show up just on grasslands and prairies, but you'll find them all across the landscape, wherever there's dung, really. But we've lost a lot of these native grazers and the diversity of native grazers on the landscape more broadly. And we've also imported a lot of non-native grazers. And the difficulty there is the dung beetles and the grazers don't have that unique relationship developed. If you bring in new grazers, or if you bring in non-native dung beetles, they don't always have those relationships developed with those specific herbivores or with those dung beetles. So whether it's they can only really effectively detect the dung of certain species, then it's going to be very difficult for them to find the dung of others, or maybe they don't prefer the dung of other species. So you have this competition going on with a lot of the non-natives. And the other is habitat loss. I mean, like I mentioned, grasslands and prairies in North America are in steep decline. So as we see those ecosystems start to decline, or we lose some of those intact native habitats, we start to see the species, including the dung beetles, start to decline. And then we have those host species. There's a lot of dung beetles that are also specialists. So I mean, they could be associated with a wide variety of mammals or lizards, or in some cases, there's even birds where there's beetles that will utilize dung and bird nests, and a lot of other dung beetle species that will utilize a lot of these resources. So as you see these host species declines and a lot of other populations of other wildlife species in North America they depend on, you'll in turn see a decline in these species that are utilizing those resources. And the last one is ivermectin is really been a hot one, especially the last several years. Ivermectin is a widely used dewormer. It's actually used to kind of rid a lot of, especially livestock, of a lot of intestinal parasites and the like. So they'll actually use this sometimes as a topical, sometimes as an oral. They'll use it in a wide variety of methods. But what happens is it can be effective in removing a lot of those endoparasites and ectoparasites. But when it passes through the body of many of these grazers, it actually, the ivermectin exists into the dung in many cases. So you'll get these species who are trying to raise their larvae in this dung. The larvae then eat the dung, thinking they're going to get the nutritional value out of it, but the ivermectin ends up killing them. And I've chatted with several ranchers since moving to Texas 2.5 years ago and starting this position that, they notice, and I've talked to ranchers all across Western North America where they've noticed, hey, the cow pies aren't going away. What's going on? Is it, just a lack of moisture and, there's not enough rain and they can't burrow in the soil? And a lot of it comes down to the first question I ask them is, do you deworm your cattle? And it's a very common practice to deworm your cattle, but that ends up being kind of the first trigger point. And they can say, definitely, I've noticed that there's a big difference in, pastures that they've been treating for these and pastures that they don't. It's been pretty well documented, but there has been less documentation behind what population level impact this is having on these dung beetles. And that's kind of the case for a lot of invertebrates. They tend to fly under the radar and we don't really notice something's happening until it's too late. I mean, we're seeing that with, a lot of pollinators and a lot of, bumblebees especially, that we're starting to really come on people's radar, monarch butterfly. We really don't start to focus a lot of our resources and our energy on these species until it's become so much of a problem that we see ecosystem services being impacted. So in this case, the dung isn't being utilized by anything. So I was going to jump in just a little bit into, the diversity of scarabs. As I mentioned, we have several hundred species in the state of Texas, but they're very diverse, from the very, very small dung beetles that you might not even notice if you looked directly at a dung pile, inches from your face, to the things that are very, very charismatic and large that are very noticeable on the landscape. And the first ones are some of the smaller ones, and these are the aphodiine dung beetles. And many of these are small, and unfortunately, most of the ones that I see most regularly, especially associated with cattle or large mammals, are some of the invasive ones. But most of the species in this subfamily of the Aphodiine are in the genus Aphodius. And there's been a lot of work that's been done across North America looking at the diversity of these species. There's tons and tons of species. It's very, very diverse in this group. And there's over 100 species actually in the subfamily. So, and like I said, most of them are in Aphodius or Atanius. They're very, very small, never really over 15 millimeters. And I would say most are closest to about 8 millimeters long. So that's pretty small, but it's still something that's visible with the naked eye. Most will feed on dung, there are dung beetles, so a lot of them will feed on dung, but they'll also feed on other things opportunistically, detritus, which is kind of decaying organic matter or other decaying materials, and some even live in close proximity or have a relationship developed with ants. So they've kind of diversified, but in general, most of them will utilize dung when it's available, and there's a lot of specialists as well within this subfamily. So in the genus Aphodius in Texas, we've got about 60 species, and those are they're very widespread, often the most abundant. If you go out, there's some of the first ones to show up at some of these dung piles, especially in the spring. I tend to see them most often in the spring and early summer. And these are some of the diggers. So these are the ones that are kind of getting into the dung that you'll see kind of getting into it and getting into the thick of the resources that are available to them. And like I said, some of them are actually specialists. So we think of, dung beetles utilizing things that are really large, like cow pies or deer droppings or, cat scat or things like that. But a lot of these dung beetles will actually utilize any dung that's out there. And some of them have specialized in things that are, really partitioned away. So ground squirrels or pocket gophers or marmots or badgers, they'll actually live into the burrows of some of these or live in the latrine sites of some of these animals and utilize the dung that's there. So they'll really find their niche and they'll specialize in some of those areas. And here's just a snapshot of some of the different species that are known from Texas. And you'll see kind of the diversity of colors and shapes and textures and just a lot of really, really pretty, really interesting. And we think about, butterflies having a lot of these intricate patterns and different colors, but you look across a lot of the other insects and they also have this incredible diversity that helps you distinguish these species. And a lot of them are, just most of the Aphodius are, a brown or a black, and they're just kind of a general dark color. But it can be difficult to tell them apart. And this is where, tools like iNaturalist with some of these smaller beetles, it can be really difficult. You might have to leave it at just it's Aphodius or it's an Aphodiine scarab or something like that, because sometimes most of these are known by internal anatomy, looking at the genitalia or looking at some of the structures on the body. That can be difficult to distinguish, just from a photo or something like that. So the next group that we're gonna look at are the Scarabeines. So this is the subfamily, and these are really, another group that's really, really obvious, especially in the Onthophagus or the Canthon, are the two genera that are very, very commonly associated with dung. And these ones, they feed on dung, and sometimes you'll even find them if you have, decomposing materials that are out there, especially carrion. You'll also sometimes find a few species that will utilize fungus, and that's usually because some fungi, when they're decomposing or as a part of the reproduction to encourage flies to come, will smell like carrion. And these are most visibly the rollers and the tunnelers. So you'll kind of have both rollers and tunnelers in this group, but your most kind of charismatic dung rollers are often in this group right here. And we have about 70 species in the subfamily in Texas. And these ones can be a little larger. They're kind of your mid-range dung beetles, mid-range to larger dung beetles. And you'll also see, a lot of these really interesting colors and a lot of the really cool head and pronotal horns and formations. And the Onthophagus, which is one of the really diverse species we have in Texas, I mean, the name literally means dung eater. And we've got about 20 species in this genus in Texas. And the males especially will have those kind of head or pronotal horns with, sometimes they'll have projections, where it's not just a single horn, but it'll kind of split and you'll have two portions of the horn. So they can really be diverse and really show some really interesting differences in the colors and the formations, and just kind of how those things have developed is really, really unique. And here's just a couple photos of some of the different Onthophagus. And if you look at those horns, you can really see the different projections and kind of how far they'll hang over the head, or if they'll go straight up. And just kind of the diversity is pretty incredible in a lot of these different species. And some of these, they kind of look like a rhinoceros because they have that projection kind of on their head. They're not the rhinoceros beetles, but sometimes they kind of look like a rhinoceros. And some of these, you'll see the difference between the males and the females as well. And here's kind of some of those Canthon species as well. And then here's the Phanius, which, everyone loves these rainbow scarabs. And this is actually a female because you don't see that big horn, but you can see, especially in that left picture where you can see that from the side, you can see that little teeny projection on there on that female. And then we'll kind of keep going through a few of these. And a lot of these, you'll start to see some diversification in color. You'll start to see some changes in size. And you'll notice, different changes in, which part of the body is larger than the others. And you'll see that between the differences between the different genera. And you can kind of see those antennae that are tucked down. A lot of times when they die, their antennae are very, very difficult to see. But like in that picture on the left, they're kind of tucked in alongside the body. And they'll do that naturally when they're not really in use. And if you have some that you collect, or if you go out and find at night, and you'll see a lot of these of other scarabs will show up at your lights on your porches at night, especially like the June beetles. Those are a scarab that don't specialize in dung, but if you get the males, you can really see when the antennae are out, especially the lined June beetles. They really like to stick their antennae out, and you can really see those really cool characteristics. Here's just a few other photos of some of our Texas species. And then just wanted to touch on a few other species. So if you're out looking at dung, if you're adventurous and you want to go out and, see some of these things in the natural world, there's other beetles that you might also find when you're exploring some dung piles. And when you're interacting with dung, one good thing to preface that I didn't mention at the beginning is there are some things that can be passed through dung, especially in a lot of the canines and felines, that you might want to avoid. So if you're not familiar with, dung and taking precautions, wearing gloves. I mean, all of us are very conscious of, sanitation right now, but it's always good to, take caution, because some of these, especially as the dung starts to dry out, the spores and other things that can be found in some of these dung can have detrimental effects. So, I mean, there's nothing, nothing that's necessarily going to kill you that I know of, but it's always good to avoid them, because some people can have, adverse reactions to different spores and fungi and things like that. But one of the groups that's really, really cool are the clown beetles. So these are the hysterids, and you can kind of see the diversity in the different sizes. And all these images are not necessarily dung associates, but I wanted to show you the diversity of some of the clown beetles as well. And many of these will use dung, anything that's rotting. So if you lost a lot of your agaves this year with the big freeze, we lost several of our big agaves in our yard. And if you let them sit for a week or two after the freeze until you decided to take care of the ones that were dying, they just put off this nasty, smells like death smell. If you had them, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But these will actually respond to a wide variety of very odoriferous things, the resources that are out there on the landscape. And then the others are the rove beetles. You'll find a lot of rove beetles, and these are the staphylinids. These are very, very diverse. They fill a lot of different niches, feeding on detritus, decomposing organic matter. You'll find a lot of them in dung and carrion, all over the landscape. And actually, we have a lot of staphylinids that are actually cave adapted in Texas. So they're a very diverse group, but you also might find these in responding to dung. And you'll notice that they're generally long and thin, and their wing coverings, their elytra, those hardened coverings that cover their flight wings, are very, very short. So they don't cover the whole abdomen, and their wings are actually tucked underneath. It's kind of like a little shawl, if you will, and their wings are just kind of tucked up underneath that. And then another that you might find, and usually if I find these in association with dung or carrion, they're the hide beetles, and you will find some of them associated with dung, usually carnivore dung, just because a lot of carnivore dung tends to have a lot of hair and skin and bone and other things that just haven't been fully decomposed in many cases. So they'll be responding to some of those extra resources that are out there that they might be able to utilize. So there are some specialists in the Trojans as well. And then last, the carrion beetles. I mean, most people associate them with carrion, but like I said, if you get some carnivores or other species that have carrion in their dung that still puts off some of those scents, they will still utilize some of those resources that are left behind. And these sylphids are also very, very pretty. I mean, they get a bad rap. I mean, because they're eating carrion, but they're filling a very important role in the ecosystem, getting rid of a lot of those the carrion and decomposing animals and other things that are out there on the landscape. So they fill a very important role. And if you've heard of the American burying beetle, other people might call these burying beetles. The American burying beetle it's been a listed species for quite a while in North America, but its populations have declined significantly because of a loss of a lot of the carrion that it relies on. And also, changes in the landscape. They like softer soils because what they do is they actually bury these things. So kind of like the burrowers and the dung beetles, these things actually take the carrion and move it underground. So you'll see these sometimes with dung as well. And if you're interested in going out and looking at dung beetles and trying to, collect them or look at them or observe them, you can do it with the naked eye or in the hand. Like I said, always make sure you've got your hand sanitizer or some way to clean your hands afterwards, because these guys are crawling around in poop, so it's gonna get on your hands. So if you're you're brave enough to go out and really explore these and really examine the diversity, make sure that you are careful about that, making sure that you're washing your hands and just, making sure that you're keeping things clean. You can also go out with nets, or you can kind of intercept them in the air. You can use pitfall traps. You can take little bits of poop and stick them into like those little ketchup cups that you get at like In-N-Out or something like that, and fill them with poop and kind of hang them above the trap. You can also dig them out, so you can flip those cow pies over, and you can, if you take a shovel and you dig into the ground underneath where that cow pie was, you can actually pull the dung beetles out of the soil and look at them, because those adults will still be down underground, putting those resources underground. And there's lots of unique techniques that I'll mention here shortly. So it's also helpful to kind of know the habitat association. So, if you're looking for a specific type of dung beetle, going where that poop is. So, I mean, if it tends to be a specialist that, is utilizing a specific type of animal's poop, then going to those places, where you might find those other animals. And then anticipating that emergence. So they're going to be active at different times of year. So some of them, they're triggered by major rain events, which this year have been a lot of dung beetles that I've been collecting in different areas of Texas, just because we've had a lot of moisture. Because if they're down in the soil, that's one of the things that triggers them. So the temperature, the soil moisture, other things like that will cause them to become active. And there's a lot of really, really good guidebooks out there on a lot of these dung beetles, that kind of more generally, but there's a lot of work that's been done on the diversity of many of these species. It gets a little more technical because they often will try and delineate between these species. And like when you get into, say, the aphodiine scarabs, it's so diverse that you can have hundreds of species, and it can get kind of technical trying to tell them apart, but it's really, really cool. And then really, if you really are interested, you have to not be afraid of poop, which is why I'm so comfortable talking about it, because, it's just one of those things that we do in my line of work, that, we like to look at the diversity, and some of them like to use poop. So like I said, go where the poop is. If you want to find them, that's where they'll be. And then some of the traditional kind of pitfall or barrier pitfall, I put a couple of these in my backyard during the pandemic, just to kind of see what was in our neighborhood. And really, if you bait them, you can also just put them out there or put them next to dung, and they'll respond to those. And the barrier pitfalls are just kind of giving you an extra likelihood that they'll hit that barrier and then move towards your pitfall. So it just increases your efficiency when it comes to trapping. And then the mammal burrow pitfall. So I mentioned like those ground squirrels and pocket gophers, they're underground. So in order to get to those, like if you have a garden, some folks were talking about the Master Gardener program, and say you have gophers in your area, and you're wanting to get rid of them, you could actually trap the gopher if you were wanting to do that. And then you could actually trap the insects and the invertebrates that are utilizing and living in those spaces underground. So this is a picture of some mammal burrow trapping that I've done before. You basically kill it, and then you dig down into the tunnel and put a pitfall in the tunnel, and then cover it up with a board, and then let the insects respond to dung. And if you're interested in really digging into this, if you know any kids that are in 4-H or FFA, pig dung is probably one of the better dungs to attract a diverse array of dung beetles. And that's actually pig dung in that pitfall trap there. And then so they'll use a variety of different kinds of dung on the landscape, different consistencies. The drier season poop is a little harder for some species to process, so they'll respond at different times of year. And then one of the really interesting techniques, I mentioned those species that live in small mammal burrows. Experts started using a technique that has been affectionately called plague scooping. And what it basically involves is going up to a squirrel burrow or something like that, sticking your arm, you have a long handled ladle, and you stick your arm down in the burrow, take the ladle and scoop up as much of the soil that's on the bottom of that burrow as possible, pull it up, and then you have someone else with a can of Raid or other insecticide who then sprays your arm and the soil that came out of the hole to kill anything that comes out, because usually when you use this technique, there are fleas everywhere. So that's why it's become affectionately called plague scooping. There's been a rumor in the entomological community that one person who was a specialist in a lot of these small mammal burrows got plagued twice. I don't know if that's possible or if that was just kind of people building the stories up, but he definitely got plagued once. and it can have it's a nasty one, so you definitely have to be careful, but it has a lot of pros and cons. A lot of really unique species have been discovered this way, and you become intimately familiar with the healthcare system because you get to deal with all these fun little pathogens that get passed on to you. There's also snakes and other mammals that want to bite you, and you know, if you get plagued, then hey, I mean, we're all familiar with, kind of being off by ourselves. Actually, the last time I gave this talk was about a week and a half before the pandemic started. So I was joking about, becoming familiar with the healthcare system, or, no one wants to hang out with you anymore, which entomologists tend to, be a little ostracized because we're a little off anyway. But it's a cool way of finding some really interesting beetles. And then another technique people realize works really well, if you're familiar with barn owls or, black-footed ferret or other species that will burrow in the ground, you can actually, they've started using artificial burrows for a lot of these species. If you get out to West Texas and get into areas where these owls are found, they've actually started making artificial burrows to kind of help the population along in some areas. And the beetles will actually respond to these artificial burrows. So they'll come, they basically hone in on those dark areas where the burrow starts, not necessarily just the burrows themselves, but then also the dung that's there. So you can artificially sample some of these things and some other really cool things, and there's no plague. So here's just a picture of, a sample that came from some of these burrow traps, and all those little black pieces are either ground beetles or they're aphodiine scarabs. And there's also cave crickets and other things that like dark spaces that'll be there as well. And when we use this, especially in other areas of the West, you find a lot of new species because no one's really tried this kind of stuff before. We found several new species in the Pacific Northwest using some of these techniques. And really, if someone's interested in trying these, no one's really out looking for these things. So the chances that you find some of these new species is actually pretty high. You don't have to go to the tropics or, to deepest, darkest Brazil to find new species of wildlife. You can go right in your own backyard. Actually, I had an intern when I was in Idaho who was on the track team, and it was running track and heard me telling people about these dung beetles, picked one up on the track, and it ended up being a new species. So, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of extra effort. So this one group that we tended to focus on that are some of these small mammal associates, there's 23 species in the New World, so that, includes Canada, Mexico. They're often flightless, very rarely collected, tend to be in sandy soils, and found in pocket gopher burrows. So there hasn't been a lot of work really studying a lot of these. There has been some work in Texas, but it really just depends on where you're at. And because they're flightless, they don't disperse very far. So, there could be one species where you guys are located, and then there wouldn't be another species for another 5-10 miles. But if there's any kind of barrier to their distribution, they can't fly. So a river would be a perfect barrier. And you'd have a new species on the other side of the river. And this behavioral adaptation is really unique. They've actually are winter active in many cases. So when a lot of things are kind of hunkered down for the year, some of them are winter active. And we found that this was the case because right when winter is getting started, the pocket gophers are up. And they're up because they're actually excavating their burrows, getting ready to kind of slow down for the winter period. So they're actually pushing a lot of these dung beetles out of their burrows that time of year and making them available out in the landscape. So that tends to be when you find them traditionally more often collected if you don't go and trap some of these burrows. So just putting the plug out there, as we often do, if folks are interested, we don't have any dung beetles on our list of species of greatest conservation need per se. We have a lot of scarabs that are on our list, but none of them tend to be dung associates. But we've seen declines across North America, and it's starting to be a lot more noticeable, especially in the Midwest. With a lot of other dung beetles that are starting to get on people's radar. So we'd like to start gathering information. So if you're out and about and you see some dung beetles, snap some pictures. If you can get some clear photos, making note if you know what kind of dung it was, if you know kind of generally the habitat is, and you can post those, on iNaturalist if you want some help identifying them. There's other resources like Bug Guide to help you learn more. And you can also jump on some of those platforms to see kind of the diversity that other folks are finding in Texas. Another great plug here, like if you're doing the the big competitions, when we're doing city nature challenge and things like that, in one dung pile, you could find 15 to 20 species. So, I mean, it really, if you really want to crank those numbers out during city nature challenge, it's another good hot spot of diversity that's in one small concentrated area. So yeah, the smaller ones, like I mentioned before, are difficult to get good photos, especially getting identifications to species. But you could also collect the material and submit it to a local collection. I mean, we've got the UT collection in Texas, in Austin. We've got Texas A&M down the road as well, that are very interested, as long as you have the information, the collecting information that's there, or you can touch base with me if you're interested as well. And I also just wanted to, that's pretty much most of what I was going to chat about with the dung beetles, just to give you guys a couple quick updates on a few other things. We're going to be, in the invertebrate program, we're going to be updating a lot of the ranks for a lot of the invertebrates as well, including some of the dung beetles. And we're trying to kind of get a snapshot of some of those species that are out there and utilizing. I wanted to use this as an opportunity to let you guys know that a lot of those data that you guys are gathering, whether it's going out to Berry Park or it's going out and making these observations on iNaturalist and other platforms, for these species that we can identify well from photos, that data is very helpful when it comes to assessing the conservation status of those species, and adding those things on. So I wanted you guys to know that when we're compiling those distribution data, or trying to assess areas where these species might occur, those observations really are being utilized in some cases, where we can really have confidence that the species is what we think it is in the photo, or has been identified to be in the photo. And we're going to be updating a lot of these ranks over the next 2 years. And just to give you guys a snapshot of some of the things that are coming up for us, we've been funding a lot of projects recently, mostly focusing on museum databasing. So all this material that's been collected over the last 150 years in Texas has gone into these museums, and many of them have just been sitting in drawers waiting for someone to harvest the data. And that's basically what we've been doing. And we've developed some relationships and funded some projects with several of the universities in Texas to try and give us more data on historically where some of these species were found. And that includes pollinators, it includes dragonflies, a lot of species that you guys might see very regularly. We're also doing a lot of work on some of the Edwards Aquifer and Trans-Pecos arthropods, especially the groundwater species that are very unique and kind of found only in this part of the world. We're also going to be updating, or actually assessing, monarch butterfly. Monarchs are not an SGCN currently, and they have never been assessed to my knowledge. They didn't meet the criteria for an SGCN the last time they were evaluated, but we're going to be doing a revision of that hopefully here in the next year to year and a half to assess their status in Texas, because we hear a lot about what's going on with monarchs globally, especially in the western US, but trying to really see what the threats are in Texas. And just kind of some of the things that we're looking at doing down the road are trying to compile more of this data that hasn't really been compiled previously, and also doing some field work in the Permian Basin, kind of in some of the coastal dune systems, which will have some really cool dung beetles, and also kind of in West Texas as well. So trying to get to some of these spots that have kind of been undersampled and undervisited historically. And just to kind of point out to folks, a lot of these photos, these images that are in there are not mine. Most of them were taken by Chris Grinter when he was in Colorado. He has some awesome photos out there online of a lot of these really cool, charismatic insects. And also a lot of the data, on distribution and numbers came from two sources, Riley and Wolf, and Gordon and Skelly, for a lot of these different species. So I definitely have to give a shout out to them, because I don't have that expertise necessarily in Texas on some of these species, so I definitely used a lot of the resources that they developed to do that. So with that, I will take any questions you guys might have.
All right, so I see one question out there. Somebody back when you were covering the ivermectin, is there anything else that ranchers can use to deworm cattle with?
Well, and a lot of the issues that there are some other products that people can use. The unfortunate thing is a lot of the residuals have not really been well tested on some of these other products that are out there. A lot of what many people, there are a lot of ranchers that don't have to deworm, or many cases especially when it's used as a topical. It's to deal with fly issues, and a lot of the fly issues, it's this cyclical thing where you have dung and lots of flies, and the flies and the reason why you have all those flies is because there's no dung beetles to process the dung. So it ends up becoming it becomes this cycle where the flies live in the dung because the dung's not disappearing. And a lot of it comes down to kind of more of a cultural control. So, if you start to, it's this balance really. I mean, where if you stop using those dewormers and you start to see more dung beetles coming back in, it's going to take time to see those changes. You're still going to be dealing with lots of flies, and you're going to be like, oh, I really should just start treating these things again. It's kind of like weeds. Like you go out and you keep pulling the weeds and you keep pulling the weeds, and the seeds are still on the ground, and you just have to keep at it and keep managing those things until finally you've worked your way through the seed bed that's in the soil in your garden, and then you can start to see the effects of all that hard work. So it's really kind of a broader IPM question than just other products to use. But a lot of the products, especially some of the newer ones, have not really been well tested to see what kind of residual impact they have. But ivermectin's been around so long, it's been pretty well documented, the impacts that it has.
Great. Somebody else was asking, are there any of these dung beetles that are attracted to UV light? And
Absolutely.
could that be used to draw them out of the burrow?
Yeah, and actually that's a technique that I use pretty regularly for dung beetles. And when I set up my black light in my backyard, I get tons and tons of, especially the aphodiine dung beetles, but you'll get a lot of the rollers as well. And the diversity is actually very high. I mean, in one night I can have 15 to 20 different dung beetle species that come into light. So yeah, it's a very, very great technique to use for dung beetles, for many of the dung beetles, especially the aphodiine dung beetles.
Cool. Somebody else was asking if they do post to iNaturalist, what would you like to see as far as photos? They're used to like posting, one photo. Is it better to have additional photos or
Yeah,
additional
definitely.
angles?
Yeah, it's definitely a good idea to have multiple angles. So having a dorsal shot, so kind of from the top looking down, and then maybe a shot from the side, and then the sometimes the clipius, which is a part of the head, it's one of the kind of located around the mouth, is sometimes pretty diagnostic for some of those species. So if you can get a good shot of the head, and for most insects, that's pretty helpful. If you can get a shot from a couple different sides, and iNat allows you to, use multiple photos. Sometimes it uses, individual photos to do kind of the automated ID, but if other people are going to look at it, it's very helpful to have kind of shots from different sides of the body. Is definitely helpful.
Ooh, somebody was saying that they had a picture of a dung beetle that looks like a Canthon imitator. They were wondering, is that common in Williamson County? They posted it to iNaturals, but they haven't gotten an ID yet.
Yeah, that's a pretty common species, and pretty widely in Texas and North America. So that's probably one of the more common Canthon species, to be honest. And the real issue, and we've been having this big debate in the entomological community when it comes to iNaturalist, is a lot of these insects, especially as you get smaller and smaller in size, they really require expertise to identify them. And there's not a lot of people who have the expertise who are going in and serving as curators in iNaturalist, because they're overwhelmed with physical specimens coming in from experts. So there are a lot of entomologists that do a lot of identifications, but it really just becomes an issue of balancing whether or not they have the ability to ID them and then have the capacity to take the time to do that.
We had somebody ask, so if you do decide to use the UV light, do you do it like put it close to the ground, do something different than you would for like attracting moths?
No, you can use the same exact setup. The moths tend to like to collect. What happens with a lot of dung beetles is they'll hit your blacklight sheet and then they'll fall to the ground. So what all of my blacklight sheets have a skirt on the bottom of them. So instead of just having a sheet that's kind of up off the ground, if you have a skirt that's on the bottom of the sheet, or if you lower the sheet to where, if you just have a bed sheet that you're using and you lower it a little bit to where you've got, maybe 12 to 18 inches on the ground below the light, they'll hit the sheet and then they'll fall to the ground, and you'll actually see tons of them all over the ground. I mean, that's probably one of the most abundant, the Aphodiine scarabs are one of the most abundant ones. I mean, I can have them by the thousands on the ground below the sheet. And then for a lot of these other scarabs and some dung beetles, if you actually do a walk around, if you have your blacklight sheet set up, and then you walk around, a couple feet away from the sheet and then 5 to 6 feet away from the sheet and work your way out, you can find other species that land away from the sheet and then crawl into the light. So different species, like if you look around a lot more, some will land on a wall above the sheet. So you're looking on vegetation and things like that. So just mix it around and move around the sheet, whereas a lot of the moths that are very visible on the sheet, especially like the noctuids and the things that can be a little more drab and blend in with the environment really well. But yeah, you can use a basic moth setup as long as I usually have a skirt on, and that helps a ton.
Would that be something that you'd want to make a note of in iNaturalist for posting where the beetle actually fell down, or whether it was farther away or landed up on top?
No,
or does that?
No, not necessarily. I mean, any little information on behavior or potential, because you never know on iNaturalist, when you post it, if it's, in some cases, especially if you don't have the familiarity, if it's something that's really common or if it's something that actually might be really rare. I've given a lot of people who are very, very avid iNaturalist users a hard time because they'll post something. I'll be like, you just found an incredibly rare species by the looks of it. Yeah, no, the first question I ask is, did you collect it? And the answer is usually no. And the second question is, well, how did you find it? And they'll be like, I don't know, it was just laying there. So, I mean, anything you can include in the description or the notes or anything like that of your observations is always helpful. I mean, when people kept really, really great field notebooks, we can go back and we can see, their observations and the things that they noted about different species. So it's always helpful. Yeah, more information is always great.
Great field notes sound like, be very useful. Somebody said there's a project on iNaturalist for beetles of Texas that you can join. Yeah,
definitely. There's several projects actually on iNaturalist, and there's a few other resources. And what you tend to find, there's a good group of curators with a variety of expertise. And I'm not super familiar with all of them, but there's definitely people, and this is the cautionary tale of iNaturalist, because anyone can elevate your species IDs or change them or go through and vote up or down. You can have people who have really, and this is what I do when I go through and I'm looking at iNaturalist data to utilize the information, is I'll look and see who did the IDs, and are they someone who tends to ID those groups more specifically, or do I know they have the expertise, as opposed to some random person from Manitoba who has never been to Texas and doesn't work on anything related to the things they're IDing. I try to be discerning there. But yeah, there's a lot of really great groups that are out there on iNaturalist and various projects that are really, really good, especially if you want to get feedback when you post your observations, making sure that if you're interested in collecting observations for certain groups, searching through the projects to see if there are projects related to those. I mean, the reptiles and amphibians and the birds and the plants, there's a lot of other great groups that are out there for other taxa. So it's always good to see if there's a project out there, then that way it gets flagged. And some of them auto pull, if there's a beetle, it automatically pulls it into the project. It just depends on how it's set up. But yeah, great projects.
It sounds like something for everybody. And one of our members would like to know, how did you get into dung beetles?
Dung beetles was probably by accident. I've always enjoyed them, and this is going to be one of those gross stories. I said we're going to be talking a lot about poop. So one thing I didn't talk about is so I was out working in the tropics with a group of other entomologists that all were working on different faunal groups, different groups of insects. And there was someone who was there who was a specialist in dung beetles. Well, if you're on an island and you don't have a great network of getting dung, like I said, dung beetles go where the dung is, and so do people when they need dung. So the humans had to produce the bait. And strangely enough, when you kind of get that familiar with dung beetles and the diversity, and you're so intimately involved in that, you really start to become more interested in what's going on there and learning from that expertise that those people had. And then I did a little bit of work with some experts in Idaho when I was working for Idaho Fish and Game for 10 years, working on some of these really unique endemics in the West and in the Rockies. So that kind of really triggered me to be really interested in dung beetles. But they're just a fascinating group. I mean, they kind of get a bad rap because they're playing with poo, but I think they're really, really fascinating. They fulfill a very, very special service. Otherwise, we'd have mountains of poop everywhere that wasn't going anywhere.
Great. I didn't even realize there were quite so many. I'm used to seeing all the ones rolling the dung around, but didn't realize that there were tunnelers and dwellers and all kinds of others. So I don't see any more questions. I know somebody was so taken with the rainbow scare up there. They said we get recertification pins every year, and so we're hoping maybe one of these years it will be a dung beetle.
Maybe I'll have to casually mention that to Michelle that, hey, that especially that rainbow scarab. I mean, that would make a really awesome pin.
That would be an awesome pin.
But she did just do American Bumblebee 2 years ago, so maybe she feels like inverts are getting a little too much attention. But I'll have to mention that. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you for the presentation. It's been really interesting, and I want to thank everybody for coming this evening. I'd like to also invite you guys for next month. We're going to have Phil Ainsley. He's been a hobby beekeeper for 10 years and the former president of the Williamson County Area Beekeepers Association, and he's going to talk about bees, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So thanks a lot for joining us, and thanks for your presentation. It's been really enjoyable, and we'll see everybody next month.